Good morning, dear students. Let me introduce you to my lecture about anatomy of the brain, encephalon. Some important terms: nucleus, collection of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system; tract, collection of axons in the central nervous system; ganglia, collection of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system; and nerve, collection of axons in the peripheral nervous system. Consist of cranial nerves and spinal nerves. The brain consists of three large principal parts: brainstem, cerebellum, and cerebral hemisphere. The brainstem is the oldest part of the brain and contains medulla oblongata, pons, and part of the midbrain. So, the brainstem processes information between spinal cord and cerebrum or cerebellum, controls automatic behaviors necessary for survival, associated with 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves covered later, includes mesencephalon midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Development of the brain. Central nervous system arises on early stages of embryo development from the external embryonic plate. At the 19th day of embryo development, the neural plate detaches from the dorsal surface of the ectoderm. The neural plate gives rise to neural groove, which becomes the base of future central nervous system. At the 4th week of development, intensive cell division leads to incorporation of the neural groove into the mesoderm. After this is formed neural tube. The neural tube is open and has anterior and posterior openings. At the end of the 4th week, the cranial end develops three dilatations called primary vesicles, because of the walls and large cavities filled with fluid. In the picture, you can see neural plate, neural groove, neural tube, white matter and gray matter. We have three primary vesicles. The biggest vesicle is called the forebrain or proencephalon. Smaller middle vesicle is midbrain or mesencephalon. The caudal vesicle is called the hindbrain. It is continuous with the spinal cord. Later, in the beginning of the second month of development, the brain appears to comprise five secondary vesicles as follows: telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, and melencephalon. You can see 5 secondary vesicles: telencephalon, dilencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, and melencephalon. Three primary and 5 secondary vesicles. Telencephalon use rice cortex, white matter, and basal nuclei. Diencephalon use rice thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. Mesencephalon use rice midbrain. Metencephalon give rise pons and cerebellum, and melencephalon gives rise medulla oblongata. In this picture, you can see anterior view of the brain stem, and you can see main parts of the brain stem: medulla oblongata, anterior surface, base of the pons, and crus of the midbrain. Most cranial nerves are located in the brain stem. There are nucleus of the cranial nerves, from 12 cranial nerves to set pairs of the cranial nerve. Posteriorly of the brain stem. Medulla oblongata, pons, and posterior surface of the midbrain. You can see fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, tuberculus gracilis and cuneatus, posterior median sulcus, posterior surface of the pons, and corpora quadrigeminina of tectum. Medulla oblongata, most inferior part of brain, connects brain to spinal cord, relays information, pyramids, to longitudinal ridges formed by corticospinal tracts, regulates autonomic functions, regulates aerosol, heart rate, blood pressure, pace for respiration, digestion, and cranial nerves number 9, 10, 11, 12. Come off or go into. Medulla oblongata. Look at this picture, students. You can see the most important elements of the medulla oblongata. You can see pyramids, medial lemniscus, reticular formation, hypoglossal nucleus, nucleus dorsalis nervi vagi, inferior olivary nucleus. Anterior surface of the medulla oblongata, where olivary nucleus, cardiovascular centers, reticular formation, nucleus gracilis et cuneatus, and other important structure of the medulla oblongata. Anterior surface, pyramids, olive, medulla nuclei, cardiovascular control center. It just force and rate of heart contraction. Respiratory centers, control rate and depth of breathing. Additional centers regulates vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. Next very important part of the brainstem is pons. Pons involved in somatic and visceral motor control. Contains the nuclei for cranial nerves number 5, 6, 7, and 8. Contains nuclei of the reticular formation. Control respiration that modifies the inflow from the medulla. Nuclei and tracts passing through to the cerebellum. Motor and somatosensory information. Nuclei and tracts to other portions of the central nervous system. Pons. Pons contains base and tegmentum. You can see fibers of pyramidal tract, fountain nuclei, reticular formation, elements of the medial lemniscus, trigeminal mesensory nucleus. Posteriorly, you can see rhomboid fossa. Rhomboid fossa contains sensory, motor, and autonomic nucleus. Medially is located motor nuclei. Laterally is located sensory nuclei. And between motor and sensory nuclei are autonomic nucleus. Cerebellum, little brain, second largest part of brain. Provides precise timing and appropriate patterns of skeletal muscles contraction to coordinate repetitive body movements and help learning complex motor behaviors. Adjust the postural muscles of the body, controls balance and equilibrium. Has two hemispheres covered with cerebral cortex. Cerebral activity occurs subconsciously, as does all processing that occur outside the cerebral cortex. So we have cerebellum, anterior lobe, posterior lobe, vermis. So left hemisphere of cerebellum and right hemisphere of cerebellum. In sagittal section, you can see white and gray matter of the cerebellum. Cerebellum receives impulse of the intent to initiate voluntary muscle contraction. Monitors all proprioceptive information and visual information about body position. Cerebral cortex calculates the best way to perform a movement. Programs and fine-tunes movements by detecting mismatches in intended and actual movements. When learning to ride a bike, throw a cable, or tie a shoe, cerebellum activity is high. When they become automatic, cerebellum is no longer involved. Mesencephalon, also called midbrain, processes sight, sound, and associate reflexes. Maintains consciousness. Cranial nerve nuclei number 3 and 4. Two basic divisions, tectum or roof and tegmentum. tectum, cerebral peduncle, which subdivide into two parts, tegmentum and base. Processes of visual and auditory sensations. Corpora quadrigemina in tectum consists of superior colliculi, visual reflex, and inferior colliculi, auditory reflex. Substantia nigra in tegmentum. Neurons inhibit activity of cerebral nuclei by releasing dopamine. If damages results in less dopamine releases and muscle tone increases, muscles rigidity, difficulty initiating movements. Parkinson's disease. Reticular formation maintain consciousness. Midbrain nuclei. Red nucleus, oculomotor nuclei, reticular formation, trochlear nuclei, and also you can see superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. Diencephalon contains pineal gland, secretes hormone melatonin, thalamus relays and processes sensory information, and the hypothalamus contains hormone production, emotion, and autonomic function. So hypothalamus regulates all this process. Hormone production, emotion, and autonomic function. You can see the encephalon. Thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. The encephalon located on the cerebrum links cerebrum with brainstem, integrates sensory information and motor commands, contains cranial nerve number 2. Thalamus. Paired egg-shaped masses connect at the midline by the intermediate mass. Nuclei project to and receive fibers from the cerebral cortex. Thalamus. Sensory relay station. All sensory that it projects to the cerebral cortex stops here first except smell. Filters are sending sensory information for primary sensory cortex. Relays information between basal nuclei and cerebral cortex. Mediate sensation, some motor activities, cortical arousal, thus learning and memory. Hypothalamus lies below thalamus. The hypothalamus features numerous nuclei, seti, Z group, into 4 areas. Like the following, the anterior hypothalamic area contains supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei. The posterior hypothalamic area that comprise the nuclei of mammillary body. The dorsal hypothalamic area that comprise several dorsal nuclei. And the intermediate hypothalamic area that comprise numerous small nuclei like the infundibulum nuclei, the lateral tuberal nuclei, the dorsomedial nuclei, the ventromedial nuclei, the dorsal nuclei, etc. Hypothalamus contains the autonomic nervous system, master oversee or homeostasis. Emotions and behavior. Mediates perception of pleasure, fear, and rage. Regulation of body temperature, blood pressure, digestive tract motility, rate and depth of breathing, and many other visceral activities. Food intake, water balance, day or night rhythm, endocrine functions. Structure of the hypothalamus. Mammillary bodies. Relay station for olfactory information. Control reflex eating movements. Pituitary gland. Major endocrine gland controls all other. Connect to hypothalamus via infundibulum. Interfaces nervous and endocrine system because it is controlled by the hypothalamus. Telencephalon consists of basal nuclei and cerebrum. Basal nuclei, also called basal ganglia, masses of gray matter found deep within the cortical white matter. The corpus striatum is composed of 3 parts: caudate nucleus, lentiform nucleus, putamen, and the globus pallidus. Fibers of internal capsule running between and through caudate and lentiform nuclei. Direct subconscious activities. You can see head of caudate nucleus, lentiform nucleus, putamen and globus pallidus, claustrum. Functions of basal nuclei are involved with subconscious control of skeletal muscle tone, regulate attention and cognition, regulate intensity of slow or stereotyped movements, walking, lifting, inhibit antagonistic and unnecessary movement, subconscious habit learning, may store simple movements patterns. Basal nuclei contains cardiac nucleus, lentiform nucleus, claustrum, you can see set ventricle, horns of the lateral ventricle, cerebral cortex, and cerebral white matter. Cerebrum, largest part of brain, make up 82% of its mass. Controls higher mental functions, including all conscious thoughts and experience, including all intellectual functions. More about this later. Processes somatic sensory and motor information. Divide into left and right cerebral hemispheres. Surface layer of gray matter, cerebral cortex. Cortex is gray matter covering cerebral hemispheres. Accounts for 40% of the mass of the brain. Folded surface increases surface area. Elevated ridges, Gary. Shallow depressions, Sulci. Deep grooves, fissures. Gray matter contains cell bodies found in cerebral cortex and basal nuclei. White matter contains fiber tracts deep to cerebral cortex surrounding basal nuclei. Myelinoid fibers, association fibers, arcuate, local, longitudinal, within one hemisphere. Commissural, we have between hemispheres, and projection, link cerebral cortex with rest of central nervous system. Projection fibers, internal capsule. All ascending and descending projection fibers to end from cerebral cortex, passes through basal nuclei. Commissural fibers, corpus callosum, connect the two cerebral hemispheres. Fiber tracks in white matter. You can see association fiber, projection fibers, commissural fibers, projection internal capsule fibers. Components of the limbic system. Corpus amygdaloidum. Deals with anger, danger, and fear responses, along with emotional smell memories. Limbic lower cerebral hemisphere. Cingulate gyrus. Plays a role in expressing emotions, via gestures, and resolves mental conflict. Hippocampus. Convert new information into long-term memories. Limbic system. Consists of cingulate gyrus, parahippocampal gyrus, amygdaloid body. Hippocampus, cingulate gyrus, isthmus, fornix, tract of white matter that connects hippocampus with hypothalamus. The encephalic structure, portions of thalamus and the hypothalamus. Reticular formation, sends impulse to the cerebral cortex to keep in conscious and alert. Important zone of the cerebral hemispheres. Primary motor cortex, primary sensory cortex, visual cortex, auditory cortex, auditory association area, olfactory cortex, gustatory cortex, also you can see the most important lobes of the hemisphere cerebri. frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. Also, you can see insula, and limbic lobe. Cerebrum, the largest division of the brain. It is divided into two hemispheres, each of which is divided into four lobes. Cerebral cortex, the outermost layer of gray matter making up the superficial aspect of the cerebrum. Gyri elevate ridges pointing around the brain. Sulci, small grooves dividing the gyri. Central sulcus divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Fissures, deep grooves, generally dividing large regions, lobes of the brain. Longitudinal fissure divides the two cerebral hemispheres. Transverse fissure separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Sylvian lateral fissure divides the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. Lobes of the brain. Let's remember frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. But please remember about insula and limbic lobe. You can see central sulcus, precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus, parieto-occipital sulcus, lateral sulcus, transverse cerebral fissure. You can see cerebellum, pons, medulla oblongata. It enables sensation, communication, memory, understanding, and voluntary movements. Temporal lobe, responsible for memory and hearing. Frontal lobe, responsible for language. Parietal lobe, responsible for sense of self, and occipital lobe, responsible for vision. Important structure of the cerebral cortex are lateral sulcus, longitudinal fissure, central sulcus, precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. Central sulcus separates motor and sensory areas. The three types of functional areas are motor areas, control voluntary movement, sensory areas, conscious awareness of sensation, association areas, integrate device information. The central gyrus or frontal lobe directs voluntary movements. Primary motor cortex is the surface of precentral gyrus. Postcentral gyrus or parietal lobe receives somatic sensory information, touch, pressure, pain, vibration, taste, and temperature. Primary sensory cortex, surface of postcentral gyrus. Each cerebral hemisphere receives sensory information from and sends motor commands to the opposite side of body. The two hemispheres have somewhat different functions, but their structure are alike. Corresponds between specific function in a specific region of cerebral cortex is not exact. No functional area acts alone. Conscious behavior involves the entire cortex. Functional difference between left and right hemispheres. In most people, left hemisphere, dominant hemisphere, controls reading, writing, and math, decision making, logic, speech, and language. Right cerebral hemisphere relates to recognition, face, voice inflections, affect, visual reasoning, emotion, artistic skills. Ventricles of the brain. We have lateral ventricle, third ventricle, mesencephalic aqueduct, and fourth ventricle. Lined by epididymal cells which help to form the choroid plexus. There are two lateral ventricles in the cerebral hemispheres. Third ventricle is located in the diencephalon. Fourth ventricle is located between the pons and the cerebellum. Cranial meninges. Dura mater consists of an outer industrial layer and an inner meningeal layer. In between the layers finds the dura sinus. Arachnoid membrane covers the surface of the brain, have a subarachnoidal space. Pia mater is inherited through the brain by astrocytes, whereas brain tightly-like sarcograph. Subdural space between arachnoidal matter and dura mater. Subarachnoidal space between arachnoid matter and pia matter. Contains collagen, elastin, fiber network, the spider web-like arachnoid tubercle, filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Subdural subarachnoidal spaces are frequent sites of intracranial bleeding. Cerebrospinal fluid surrounds all exposed surface of the central nervous system. Cushions, supports, and transports. Interchanges with interstitial fluid of brain, like plasma or interstitial fluid, elsewhere except much more poor, are needle villi, protrude superiorly into Dura sinus and permit cerebrospinal fluid to be absorbed into venous blood. Cerebrospinal fluid flow through ventricles throughout middle space to Dura sinus, back to circulation. Thank you. Goodbye.